Hello, I'm continuing my reviews on the Alien series with Alien 3. Now, Alien 3, of course, is the third film in the Alien franchise. Now, this came out in 1992. Now, Alien 3 is perhaps one of the most polarizing sequels ever made. Like, people are really in two camps about this movie. There are some people who absolutely despise this movie to the core, and then there are some people who actually really like the movie. Me, I have very mixed feelings on this movie. Now, I did a review for this movie a couple of years ago that I did take down, but in my old review of this movie, I actually did give this movie a pretty positive review, but after rewatching the movie and really thinking about what this movie could have been, honestly, I do have a lot of problems with this movie. Now, I don't hate this movie, but I do have a lot of problems with it, though. Now, before this movie, there was actually an Aliens comic book series which picked up where the movie Aliens left off. So, if you really don't like this movie, just read the comic books, because really the Aliens comics almost act as an alternate Alien 3. Now, I haven't read all of the Aliens comics. I've only read a few of them, but from the Aliens comics that I've read, they actually mostly follow Hicks and Newt, and Newt in the comic books is actually a teenager, and from the comic books that I've read, in those comics, the xenomorphs actually somehow make it to Earth and pretty much wipe out most of the human race. And from what I've read of the series, it is actually a really good comic book series. So, once again, if you're not a fan of Alien 3 and you want to see an alternate Alien 3, just read the Aliens comic books. Now, one of the most interesting things about this movie, for me, really is the history behind this movie, and I can't possibly talk about all the history behind this movie in one video, but there's a lot of really interesting behind-the-scenes stuff about what went on during the making of this movie, and frankly, I find some of the history of this movie to really be more interesting than the movie itself. Now, if you're interested in finding out some of the backstory behind this movie, if you have the Alien Quadrilogy box set, this box set actually comes with a documentary on the making of Alien 3. Another place you could go to find out some pretty interesting information about this movie is, now, I listen to this podcast called The Projection Booth sometimes, and each episode of The Projection Booth, they talk about a different movie, and there was one episode they did on Alien 3, which actually had Brad Jones, who most people would know as the cinema snob in it, but in that episode of The Projection Booth, they talked a lot about the history of Alien 3, and they also interviewed a lot of people who worked on Alien 3 in that episode. So, if you're really interested in finding out some of the backstory behind this movie, just listen to that episode of the podcast, The Projection Booth. Now, this movie went through so many different scripts and directors. Now, originally, Renny Harlin was actually going to direct this movie. Now, Renny Harlin, at this point, had directed A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, and I think he also directed Die Hard 2 around this time as well, so 20th Century Fox, they wanted him to direct Alien 3, but for one reason or another, Renny Harlin pretty much dropped out of the project. Now, I've heard that it was because he really felt like he was not going to be able to top what Ridley Scott did in the first film, or even what James Cameron did with the second film, but there probably were other factors that caused him to drop out of the project as well. So, after Renny Harlin dropped out of the project, the directing job went to David Fincher, who at this point had only directed music videos, and David Fincher would go on to direct movies like Seven and The Game and Fight Club and The Social Network and the American version of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and Gone Girl. Now, David Fincher, of course, is a great director, and this was his first movie, but according to everything that I've heard, this really was not a very good experience for David Fincher, and I even heard that he almost took his name off this movie, and according to everything I've heard, apparently Walter Hill and David Giler, who were the main producers of this movie and also ended up writing the movie, they really treated David Fincher like crap during the making of this movie. Like, really, the producers behind this movie really ended up fucking David Fincher in the ass during the making of this film. Now, I mentioned in my review on Alien that Walter Hill and David Giler were really the ones responsible for Alien being as good as it actually is. It's almost the complete polar opposite with this movie. While they are the ones responsible for the first Alien movie really being as good as it actually is, they're kind of the ones responsible for this movie not being as good as it could have been. Now, before they finally settled on a script, this movie went through many different scripts. Now, one of the original scripts for this movie actually had a lot of Cold War metaphors in it. Like, the original script for this movie was all going to be a big metaphor for the nuclear arms race that was going on between the United States and Russia during the Cold War, but at the time they finally started making this movie, the Cold War was coming to an end at that point, so at that point that script really didn't work anymore. There was also another script for Alien 3 that was actually written by David Twohy, who would go on to make the Chronicles of Riddick movies, and apparently his script for Alien 3 is very similar to what the movie Pitch Black, which was the first Riddick movie, ended up being. But for one reason or another, David Twohy's script never got made. There was also another Alien 3 script that was actually written by Eric Red, who before this wrote The Hitcher and Near Dark, but for one reason or another his script never got made either. I also have heard somewhere that James Cameron even considered making Alien 3, and I heard that his idea for Alien 3 was actually going to take place on Earth, and it was really going to focus on Ripley, Hicks, and Newt, who end up becoming a family in Alien 3, and I know some original ideas for this movie were actually going to take place on Earth. Now, perhaps one of the most famous scripts for Alien 3, which never got made, was an idea from Vincent Ward about the wooden planet. Now, Vincent Ward would go on to direct the movie What Dreams May Come, which was based on the Richard Matheson novel of the same name. Now, Vincent Ward's idea for Alien 3 was it was going to be set on what was pretty much going to be a church in space. Like, it was going to be set on this giant spaceship actually made out of wood, and it was going to be called the Wooden Planet. Like, it was a spaceship made out of mostly wood. Obviously, there was some technology there to give the wooden planet its atmosphere and its gravity, but for the most part it was going to be made of wood, and the plot line of Alien 3 was it was going to follow all these monks on this wooden planet, and somehow a xenomorph ends up on this wooden planet, and the monks actually think that the xenomorph is the devil. And for a while, that script for Alien 3 was actually going to be the script that they were going to start shooting, but Walter Hill and David Giler, for one reason or another, didn't like that script, so they ended up scrapping the idea, but they still kept some ideas from that original script for Alien 3 and put them in the movie Alien 3 that we got. For example, the movie is not set on a wooden planet inhabited by monks. It's actually set on a prison planet. However, the prisoners on this planet do live a very monk-like existence. So that's one aspect of the original script that did get used for this movie. Another aspect that they used is, in the movie, there's a crazy guy who actually thinks that the xenomorph is a dragon, which is kind of loosely based on the idea from the original script of the monks believing that the xenomorph is the devil. And the movie does have a lot of religious overtones in it, which is probably something taken from Vincent Ward's original idea for Alien 3. So even though they didn't use Vincent Ward's idea, Vincent Ward still got a story credit for this movie. Now, the Alien Quadrilogy box set actually comes with two versions of the movie, the theatrical version and then another version which is actually called the assembly cut. Now, I've seen both versions, but the assembly cut is the version that I recently watched, so I could do this review. Now, one of the main differences between the theatrical version and the assembly cut is, in the theatrical version, the alien ended up bursting out of a dog. In the assembly cut, the alien ended up bursting out of an ox. So, the plot of the movie that we finally did get is, basically, it's set a few years after the events of Aliens, and the movie begins where Ripley, Hicks, and Newt and Bishop are in hypersleep aboard the Sulaco. I think I'm saying the name of that ship right, which is the military attack vessel that the Colonial Marines used in the previous film. But for one reason or another, well, because of a fire on board the ship, Ripley, Hicks, and Newt, they're ejected out of the Sulaco, and they end up crash landing on a prison planet, and their escape shuttle lands in the ocean, and basically it turns out that Hicks and Newt ended up dying, and Ripley was the only one who survived, and what happens is these prisoners on this prison planet find her, and basically she's kind of stuck there, and already there's a lot of tension because a lot of these prisoners are rapists and murderers, and a lot of them haven't seen a woman for a very long time, so already there's a lot of tension there, and basically, long story short, it turns out that somehow a facehugger got on board the ship, and basically in the theatrical version, a facehugger ends up latching itself onto a dog. In the assembly cut, it ends up latching itself onto an ox, and basically, an alien ends up coming out of the dog or ox, depending on which version of the movie you watch, and basically the plot of the movie from then on is this alien is now terrorizing the prisoners on this prison planet, and now they all have to work together to try to stop the alien. Now, in this movie, the xenomorph actually moves on all fours like that of a dog or an ox, depending on which version of the film you watch. Now, this movie introduces the idea that the xenomorphs actually take on some of the physical characteristics of whatever animal that they gestate inside of, and they kind of use that idea a little bit in the Alien vs. Predator movies, which, yes, I know it is debatable whether or not the Alien vs. Predator movies are actually canon, but they did kind of use that idea a little bit in the Alien vs. Predator movies, because in those movies, there was a part where a predator got a facehugger on him, and then a baby alien burst out of the predator's chest, and this alien kind of looked a little bit like a predator. First of all, I want to say sorry about the dramatic change in lighting. Now, as I said earlier on in this video, I don't hate this movie, but I do have a lot of problems with it, and really a lot of my problems with this movie are really based on what this movie could have been compared to what it ended up being. And perhaps my biggest problem with this movie is also a problem that a lot of other people have. It's the fact that they killed off the characters of Hicks and Newt really between movies, because you don't actually see Hicks and Newt get killed, but really in this movie the characters of Hicks and Newt, they get killed off really within the opening of this movie, and for one, that was really unnecessary, but also the way they killed those characters off really was kind of insulting to the characters. Like, in Aliens, Ripley spends that whole movie trying to protect Newt and defend Newt from the aliens, and just to have Newt die off in the opening of this movie, it almost makes everything that Ripley did in the previous film worthless, and really, once again, it was just kind of insulting to kill off the characters of Hicks and Newt in that way. Now, I actually wouldn't have minded if they killed off those characters, but still have the characters in the movie. To me, it would have a lot more emotional impact if, like, you had the characters of Hicks and Newt in this movie and had them live throughout most of the movie, but then towards the end, maybe you kill them off. That would have, to me, would have a lot more emotional impact, but really, like, in the beginning of this movie, Hicks and Newt, they die, and there's, like, Ripley, she definitely shows some emotion about this, but after, they have a little autopsy on Newt, that's really it. They don't really mention Hicks or Newt at all throughout the rest of the movie. And also, having Newt in this movie would have actually added a lot more drama to the story, because think about it, you'll have a little girl on a planet filled with rapists, murderers, and child molesters. That would have added a lot more drama to the story, because then you would have Ripley having to defend Newt against all these, like, scumbags, pretty much. But of course they didn't do that. Instead they just killed off the characters of Hicks and Newt in a really stupid way. Another problem I have with the movie is there are definitely some plot holes in the movie, and also there are characters in this movie who really could have been very interesting characters, but the movie doesn't really touch on them as much as it should. For example, there's a character in this movie played by Charles S. Dutton, who, in the beginning of the movie, when Ripley first meets him, he says to her, "You don't want to get to know me. I'm a murderer and rapist of women." So you realize that this is a bad guy, yet throughout most of the movie, he's actually a really awesome character. And yes, I get it that he's supposed to be a bad person trying to find redemption, but they should have touched on that more. They should have touched on it more, that this guy, though he is like one of the protagonists of the movie, he's also really not a good person, or definitely has done a lot of really bad things. Also, in the movie, there's this crazy guy who actually thinks that the alien is a dragon, and he starts to think that the alien is actually his friend, and they really could have done so much more with that character, too, because the movie almost builds him up as being, like, the human villain of the story, but really they don't really do much with that character. Also, in this movie, you have some really, really shitty CGI effects for, like, the alien. Now, throughout most of the movie, the alien is practical, but there is some CGI effects for the alien, like when you see the alien running, and it looks so freaking bad. But to be fair, this did come out in 1992, and back then, CGI effects in movies really didn't look that good, because at that point CGI was a relatively new thing. But at the same time, though, the year before this, you had Terminator 2, which also had a lot of CGI effects in it, yet the effects work in Terminator 2 hold up better than the effects work in this movie. Now, despite my problems with this movie, I actually don't hate this movie. There's actually quite a bit of stuff about this movie that I actually do really like. Like, I do think it's actually a very well-made movie, despite the CGI alien, which does look like crap. Besides that, it is a pretty well-made movie, and actually a really well-acted movie as well. Like, all the acting in the movie is really good. Like, Sigourney Weaver, of course, once again reprises her role as Ripley, and she does do a really good job in this movie. So I do think it's a well-made movie, I just don't think it's a very well-written movie. And another thing I do like about this movie is the movie has a very bleak and depressing tone to it, and a very depressing atmosphere, and it is actually a really depressing movie. But the thing is, though, once again, it was almost too depressing, the fact that they killed off the characters of Hicks and Newt like that. And once again, I wouldn't have minded if they killed those characters off, but still have them in the movie. Like, have them get killed off maybe later on in the movie. That, I think, would have worked a lot better and would have had a lot more emotional impact. But once again, I do like that the movie does have a very bleak and depressing tone to it. And the movie actually does have some pretty dark humor in it. Like, there is actually some humor in this movie. Like, there's a scene in this movie where the alien comes down from a vent in, like, a cafeteria, and it grabs the warden of this prison and pulls him up into the vent, and all these prisoners were watching this, and it cuts to one of the prisoners, and he just screams, "Fuck!" And then shortly after that, one of the prisoners has to mop up all the blood, and he's all paranoid, and he's looking up at the vent to make sure that an alien doesn't come down again. So there is some really funny dark humor in this movie. So, I certainly do not hate this movie. I just have some major problems with it, though. But yeah, that's my review on Alien 3, and bye.